Coffee burned her knuckles, but Caprice didn't flinch. The barrel of a snub-nosed revolver rested against the diner's cheap Formica counter, inches from her order pad. The man sitting across from her owned the city's underworld. He expected fear. He expected her to crumble, to beg to avert her eyes like everyone else in this god-forsaken town. Instead, she leaned in her voice, slicing through the heavy silence. "Pull that stunt again, and I'll end you." Neon light flickered overhead, casting a sickly green pallor over the scarred linoleum floor. Caprice Thompson hated Tuesdays. Tuesdays meant the graveyard shift at Archie's Diner, a purgatory of sticky booths, bottomless coffee cups, and the worst kind of quiet. She leaned against the counter, a damp, ammonia-scented rag hanging limp from her blistered fingers. Her back ached. A dull, rhythmic throb at the base of her spine had become a permanent fixture in her life, much like the smell of stale fryer grease permanently woven into her dark hair. Rain lashed against the cracked front window, blurring the neon open sign into a bleeding red smudge against the black pavement outside. It was 2:14 a.m., the hour when the drunks sobered up just enough to be mean, and the ghosts of the city crawled out to seek shelter. Caprice watched the clock. The second hand swept in a stuttering, agonizing circle. She calculated her rent in her head. 3 double shifts this week. If she skipped groceries on Thursday and lived off the bruised diner fruit Archie threw out, she might make the heating bill. Poverty was a full-time job. It occupied every waking thought, a low-level hum of anxiety that never, ever stopped. The bell above the glass door chimed a harsh, cheerful sound that shattered the silence. Cold air swept into the diner, carrying the metallic scent of rain and wet asphalt. 3 men walked in. The 2 in the back were built like bank vaults, wide, thick-necked, radiating a blunt force kind of violence. They wore leather jackets that squeaked as they moved, but it was the man in the front who sucked the oxygen out of the room. Denver Wallace. Caprice recognized him immediately. Everyone in the South District knew Denver Wallace. You didn't survive in this neighborhood without knowing whose territory you were standing on. He wasn't loud. He wasn't overly large. He wore a tailored charcoal overcoat that looked like it cost more than Caprice's entire building. His dark hair was slicked back, catching the harsh diner lights, and his eyes were hollow. Empty, like a house where all the furniture had been covered in sheets and the doors locked from the outside. He didn't look at Caprice. He didn't look at anything in particular. He simply walked to the corner booth, the one with the torn red vinyl, and slid in. The 2 heavy hitters flanked the aisle, standing like gargoyles. Caprice swallowed dryly. She grabbed a fresh pot of coffee and 2 ceramic mugs. Head down. Do the job. Don't look them in the eye. That was the rule of the South Side. She walked over her rubber-soled shoes, squeaking against the wet floor. "Coffee?" she asked. Her voice was flat, devoid of the forced cheer she reserved for the morning regulars. Denver didn't answer. He was staring out the rain-streaked window. One of the muscleheads, a guy with a jagged scar running through his left eyebrow, sneered. "Leave the pot, sweetheart, and step back." Caprice set the pot on the table. She was turning to leave when the diner door chimed again. A young man stumbled in. He was soaked to the bone, his chest-heaving eyes blown wide with a terror so pure it made Caprice's stomach twist. He didn't even make it 3 steps past the threshold before Denver's men moved. It was fast. Too fast. 1 second the kid was turning to run, and the next the scarred brute had him by the collar, dragging him backward across the linoleum. The kid's wet sneakers squeaked frantically against the floor. He was thrashing, sobbing. "Mr. Wallace, please, I have the money. I just need 2 days." The kid screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. Denver finally turned his head. He looked at the boy with the mild irritation of a man swatting a fly. He gestured lazily with 2 fingers. The brute hoisted the boy up by his throat and slammed him onto the front counter. right where Caprice had just spent 20 minutes scrubbing away dried ketchup and cigarette ash. Glass sugar dispensers rattled. A napkin holder crashed to the floor, metal clattering loudly. The kid gasped for air, his face turning a mottled purple as the brute pinned him flat against the formica. Denver stood up slowly. He walked over to the counter, unbuttoning his overcoat. He reached inside his suit jacket and pulled out a heavy, snub-nosed revolver. The metal gleamed under the fluorescent lights. He placed the barrel directly against the boy's cheekbone. 2 days is 48 hours, Denver said. His voice was smooth, a low baritone that didn't need volume to command absolute terror. You've had 720 hours. Time is a finite resource, Leo. You are wasting mine. Caprice stood by the coffee station. Her heart wasn't hammering. It had stopped entirely. The air in the diner felt thick, unbreathable. She looked at the boy. He couldn't be older than 19. She looked at the gun. Then she looked at the mess they had made of her counter. The shattered napkin holder. The muddy boot prints smeared across the clean linoleum. Something inside Caprice snapped. It wasn't bravery. Bravery was for cops and idiots. It was the sheer, unadulterated exhaustion of a woman who had worked 60 hours a week for a decade and still couldn't afford a winter coat. It was the absolute disrespect of dragging the filth of the streets into her sanctuary, the one place she had scrubbed clean. She walked over. She didn't tiptoe. She marched. She slammed her order pad down on the counter mere inches from the gun. The sharp smack echoed through the empty diner like a gunshot itself. The two brutes jolted, staring at her in disbelief. Denver didn't flinch, but his eyes shifted, locking onto hers. They were dark, cold, calculating. "Get him off my counter," Caprice said. Her voice didn't shake. It came out low, raspy, vibrating with a rage that surprised even her. The scarred man laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Shut your mouth, Waitress, before you catch a stray. Pull that stunt again, and I'll end you." Caprice interrupted, stepping directly into Denver's line of sight. She ignored the goon completely. She spoke only to the boss. "You want to play gangster, do it in the gutter where you belong, not on my freshly bleached counter. Now get him up, before I pour a pot of boiling decaf down your throat." Silence fell over the diner. It was a suffocating, heavy silence. The only sound was the rain hitting the glass and the kid gasping for air. Denver Wallace stared at her. For 3 long seconds the world stopped spinning. Caprice realized with a sudden icy clarity that she was going to die. She was going to die over a dirty counter. Denver didn't move. He kept the gun pressed to the boy's cheek, but his eyes were entirely fixed on Caprice. He studied her face, the dark circles under her eyes, the cheap faded uniform, the white-knuckled grip she had on the edge of the formica. He was dissecting her, searching for the bluff. People always bluffed. They puffed their chests and raised their voices, but underneath they were trembling. Caprice wasn't trembling. She was furious. Her jaw was set, her lips pressed into a thin white line. She looked at the gun in his hand, then back up to his eyes, her expression screaming, "Do it. Just see what happens." The scarred brute took a step forward, reaching inside his jacket. "Boss want me to—" "No," Denver said quietly. He didn't raise his voice, but the brute stopped, instantly freezing like a reprimanded dog. Denver slowly withdrew the gun from the boy's face. He clicked the safety on and slipped the weapon back into his shoulder holster in one fluid motion. He looked down at the boy who was now weeping openly, snot and tears mingling on the clean counter. "Get him out of here," Denver murmured, not taking his eyes off Caprice. "He has until Friday noon. Then we don't talk anymore." The brute hauled the kid off the counter by his belt, dragging him roughly toward the door. The second man followed. The bell chimed, the door slammed, and just like that the diner was empty again. Except for Caprice and the mob boss. Denver stood across from her. The height difference was suddenly glaring. He was at least 6'2", his broad shoulders blocking out the neon lights behind him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. He placed it on the counter right next to the muddy smudge the boy's shoe had left. "For the bleach," Denver said. A ghost of a smirk played at the corner of his mouth. It was there for a fraction of a second, gone before Caprice could even process it. Then he turned on his heel and walked out into the rain. Caprice stood frozen for a full minute after his car pulled away. Then the adrenaline broke. It hit her like a physical blow. Her knees buckled, and she grabbed the edge of the counter to keep from collapsing. Her breath came in short, jagged gasps. Her hands began to shake violently, rattling the ceramic coffee mugs. What did I just do? She had threatened Denver Wallace, a man who allegedly had a city councilman's legs broken last year over a zoning dispute, a man who controlled the docks, the unions, and half the police precinct. She had threatened to pour coffee on him. A cold sweat broke out across her forehead. She felt nauseous. She stumbled to the back room, pushing through the swinging doors into the cramped, grease-stained kitchen. She leaned over the deep sink and splashed freezing water onto her face. "You're an idiot, Caprice. A stupid, reckless idiot." She looked at her reflection in the spotted mirror above the sink. She looked old. 32, but she looked 40. The lines around her mouth were carved deep by stress. She didn't have a death wish. She really didn't. She had a cat to feed, a mountain of debt to pay off, and a quiet, desperate hope that maybe someday things would get easier. But out there in the diner, the anger had simply outpaced the fear. She spent the rest of her shift jumping at every passing pair of headlights. Every time a car slowed down outside the diner, her heart slammed against her ribs. She kept a heavy iron skillet on the shelf below the counter, as if a frying pan would stop a bullet. When 6 a.m. finally rolled around Archie, the manager walked in. He was a balding man who constantly smelled of cheap cigars and peppermint. He took one look at her pale face and the shattered napkin holder in the trash. "Rough night, kid?" Archie asked, tying a stained apron around his waist. "You have no idea," Caprice muttered. She clocked out. She grabbed her threadbare coat from the break room and stepped out into the freezing morning air. The rain had stopped, leaving the city looking washed out and grey. She walked the 6 blocks to her apartment. Her neighborhood was a grid of crumbling brick walk-ups and pawn shops. She climbed the 3 flights of stairs to her apartment, the wood groaning in protest under her feet. She locked the deadbolt. She slid the chain into place. She shoved a wooden chair under the doorknob. She crawled into bed, fully clothed, staring up at the water stains on the ceiling. Every creak of the floorboards outside her door sounded like a hitman. Every distant siren sounded like a warning. She waited for the knock on the door. She waited for the door to be kicked in, but sleep eventually claimed her, pulling her down into a dark, exhausted void. A week passed. 7 days of looking over her shoulder. 7 days of walking home with a can of pepper spray clenched in her fist, her keys woven between her knuckles. But nothing happened. No black sedans trailed her. No thugs showed up at her apartment. The city went on bleeding and breathing, completely indifferent to Caprice Thompson and her moment of temporary insanity. By Tuesday, she had convinced herself she was in the clear. Men like Denver Wallace didn't care about waitresses. He had bigger problems, larger empires to manage. To him, she was just a loud, annoying bug he had decided not to step on. It was 4 p.m. A rare afternoon shift. The diner was busy humming with the clatter of silverware and the low murmur of conversation. The smell of frying bacon and toasted rye bread filled the air. Caprice was balancing 3 plates of meatloaf on her left arm, navigating between the narrow tables. "More coffee, Hon," an elderly trucker called out from booth 4. "Coming right up, Mac?" Caprice shouted back, sliding the meatloaf plates onto a table of construction workers. She turned back toward the counter to grab the coffee pot. That's when she saw him. He was sitting at the counter. The exact same stool. Denver Wallace. He wasn't wearing the heavy overcoat this time. Just a tailored black suit, his tie loosened slightly at the collar. He looked entirely out of place in the daylight amidst the working-class crowd and the bright yellow fluorescent bulbs. He was alone. No muscleheads, no guns drawn. He was just sitting there reading a folded newspaper. Caprice stopped dead in her tracks. The diner noise seemed to fade into a dull buzz. Her chest tightened, the familiar grip of panic squeezing her lungs. He hadn't forgotten. He had just been busy. She took a deep breath, forcing her shoulders to drop. You survived him once. You can survive him again. She grabbed the coffee pot. Her hands were surprisingly steady. She walked over and stood across the counter from him. What do you want? She asked. No pleasantries, no fake customer service smile. Denver didn't look up from his paper. Black coffee, nothing in it. Caprice poured the coffee. The dark liquid steamed in the white ceramic mug. She set it down in front of him. She didn't walk away. She crossed her arms, waiting. He took a slow sip, his eyes scanning the financial section. Finally, he folded the paper and set it aside. He looked up at her. In the daylight, his eyes weren't empty. They were sharp, intensely observant. You have terrible survival instincts, Caprice, he said. His voice was quiet, a private conversation in a crowded room. Caprice stiffened. He knew her name. Of course he knew her name. He probably knew her social security number, her blood type, and the fact that she owed 3 months' rent. I've survived this long. She shot back, keeping her voice low. If you're here to finish whatever you started last week, do us both a favor and take it outside. I don't want to scrub blood off the floor again. Denver let out a low, breathy chuckle. It was a genuine sound of amusement. You really think I came here to kill you over a dirty counter? I think you kill people for less. Fair assessment. He conceded, leaning forward slightly. He rested his elbows on the counter. But no, I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here because I'm curious. Curious about what? About a woman who looks down the barrel of a loaded gun and worries about the Formica. He tilted his head, studying her again. I looked into you, Caprice Thompson. 32. No criminal record. Work 60 hours a week. You owe $8,000 to a loan shark named Mickey the Rat Sullivan, a man who is notorious for breaking fingers when payments are late. Caprice felt the blood drain from her face. Mickey was a low-level thug, a parasite who preyed on desperate people in the South Side. She had borrowed the money to pay for her mother's funeral 2 years ago. The interest rates were astronomical. She was drowning. That's none of your business, she whispered, fiercely, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. It became my business when Mickey decided to borrow money from me to fund his little lending operation, Denver said smoothly. He took another sip of coffee. He's late on his payments, which means by proxy your debt belongs to me now. Caprice gripped the edge of the counter. The room spun slightly. If Denver Wallace owned her debt, she wasn't just drowning anymore. She was already at the bottom of the ocean. I can pay, she lied through her teeth. I just need time. Time is a finite resource. He quoted himself, a dark amusement dancing in his eyes. He reached into his suit jacket. Caprice flinched, expecting the gun. Instead, he pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. He placed it on the counter between them. I don't want your money, Caprice, Denver said. She stared at the envelope as if it were a live grenade. Then what do you want? I have a problem. A logistical issue within my organization, he said, carefully choosing his words. My people are loyal. They are tough, but they are not subtle. They stand out. They make noise. I need someone who doesn't. Someone invisible. Someone who can walk into a room, clear a table, serve a drink, and listen. Caprice stared at him, her mind racing. You want me to be a spy? I want you to cater a private poker game this Friday night. Denver corrected. High stakes, very exclusive clientele, men who talk too much when they drink. You will serve them, you will pour their scotch, and you will remember everything they say about the waterfront development project. He pushed the envelope closer to her. In that envelope is your marker, your debt completely forgiven, paid in full. Serve the drinks, listen to the conversation, and you walk away clean. You never see me again. Caprice looked at the envelope. $8,000. The weight that had been crushing her chest for 2 years sitting right there in a paper folder. It felt like a trap. The devil doesn't make deals unless he wins. And if I say no? She asked. Denver stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket, his face returning to that cold, unreadable mask. If you say no, I collect the debt. By the end of the week. With interest. He didn't wait for her to answer. He turned and walked out of the diner, the bell chiming cheerfully in his wake. Caprice stood alone behind the counter. She looked at the envelope. She looked at the steam rising from his half-empty coffee mug. The diner hummed loudly around her, completely oblivious to the fact that Caprice Thompson had just been dragged into the dark. She reached out her fingers, trembling slightly, and picked up the envelope. The address typed on the card inside the envelope led Caprice to the top floor of a renovated textile mill on the east side. There was no sign, just a heavy steel door and a security camera that blinked with a solitary red, unblinking eye. Friday night air bit at her cheeks as she stood on the loading dock. She wore the uniform they had messengered to her apartment that morning, a crisp black button-down shirt, tailored black trousers and soft-soled shoes. It fit perfectly. That detail alone made her stomach turn. Denver Wallace didn't just know her debt, he knew her measurements. She pressed the buzzer. The heavy door clicked open with a metallic thud. A man was waiting inside. It was the brute with the jagged scar from the diner. He looked her up and down, offering no smile, no recognition. Phone. He grunted, holding out a massive, calloused hand. Caprice fished her cracked smartphone from her pocket and dropped it into his palm. He ran a metal detector wand over her body, the device humming softly in the quiet hallway. When he was satisfied, he nodded toward a set of double oak doors at the end of the corridor. Keep your mouth shut. Keep the glasses full. You don't speak unless spoken to. He instructed, his voice a gravelly rasp. You hear something, you keep it in your head until the boss asks. Caprice swallowed the lump of dry air in her throat and pushed through the doors. The room smelled of wealth. It was a heavy, suffocating blend of aged bourbon, expensive cigar smoke, and leather. Low-hanging amber lights cast a warm glow over a massive mahogany poker table in the center of the room. The rest of the penthouse was swallowed in shadow, save for the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering skyline of the city. 5 men sat around the table. Caprice recognized 3 of them from the local news. A prominent city councilman whose face was plastered on re-election billboards downtown, a union boss who controlled the transit workers, and Denver. Denver sat at the head of the table. He wore a dark navy suit tonight, his tie discarded. He held his cards close to his chest, his face an impenetrable mask of relaxed indifference. He didn't look up when Caprice entered. He didn't even twitch. To him, she was already a ghost. Caprice moved to the polished wet bar in the corner. Her hands knew this rhythm. For 10 years, she had balanced scalding plates, remembered complex orders, and navigated the cramped, chaotic space of Archie's diner. Being invisible was a waitress's true currency. People stopped seeing you the moment you put down their plate. You became part of the furniture, a vessel for their food and drink. She poured scotch over heavy spherical ice cubes. She sliced lemon twists. She walked the perimeter of the room, approaching the table with silent, practiced steps. "Hit me." The union boss, a heavy-set man named Miller, grumbled around a wet cigar. The dealer slid a card across the green felt. Caprice placed a fresh glass of bourbon near Miller's elbow, seamlessly whisking away the empty one. He didn't look at her. "The waterfront zoning is a mess, Dom," the councilman said, tossing 3 red chips into the center pile. "The mayor is getting cold feet. The press is poking around the shell companies." "Let them poke," Denver replied smoothly, not taking his eyes off his cards. "The shell companies trace back to a holding firm in Panama. By the time they dig through the paperwork, the concrete will already be poured." Caprice moved to the far end of the table near a man she didn't recognize. He was younger than the others, with sharp, nervous features and a restless energy. He tapped his rings against the mahogany. "Concrete is one thing," the nervous man said, his voice tight. "But the shipment on Tuesday, the feds have been heavy at Pier 4. We reroute it costs us 20%. We don't reroute Garrison." Denver said, his voice dropping an octave. The shift in tone was subtle, but the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. "We own the port, Inspector. The shipment comes through Pier 4. Caprice stood 3 feet behind Garrison, a tray balanced on her fingertips. She watched his reflection in the dark glass of the window. Garrison's jaw tightened. He glanced quickly at the councilman, a split-second exchange of anxiety. "Sure, Dom," Garrison muttered, folding his cards. "Pier 4. An hour passed. The pile of chips in front of Denver grew steadily. The other men drank heavier, their voices growing louder, their filters eroding with every empty glass of scotch. Caprice kept the liquor flowing. She faded into the shadows, leaning against the back wall, listening. Her diner memory kicked in. Table 4, 2 eggs over easy bacon, crisp rye toast, dry. Table 6, black coffee, double sugar, separate checks. Only now it was Garrison is lying. The councilman is sweating. Pier 4 is a trap. It happened during a break. Denver stepped out to the balcony to take a call. The councilman excused himself to the restroom. Garrison was left alone at the table with Miller, the union boss. Caprice moved in to clear the empty glasses. Garrison leaned in close to Miller, his voice a harsh, frantic whisper. "Wallace is blind. He thinks he owns the inspector. He doesn't know the feds flipped him on Thursday." Miller chewed his cigar, his eyes narrowing. "You're sure?" "I saw the surveillance photos," Garrison hissed, checking the balcony door. "The raid happens the second the crates touch the dock. Wallace goes down. We just need to make sure our names aren't on the manifest when the feds tear the shipping containers apart. I've already made a deal with the DA immunity." "You're a dead man if he finds out." Miller grunted. "He won't," Garrison said, taking a nervous gulp of his drink. "By Wednesday, Denver Wallace will be sitting in a federal holding cell, and we take over the South District." Caprice picked up Garrison's empty glass. The ice clinked softly against the crystal. Garrison froze. He looked up at her, really looking at her for the first time all night. Panic flared in his eyes. For a terrifying second, Caprice thought he might reach for a weapon. She didn't flinch. She gave him the same dead-eyed, exhausted look she gave drunks at 3 a.m. who complained about cold fries. "Another scotch, sir?" she asked, her voice flat bored. Garrison stared at her face, searching for a reaction. He found nothing but a tired waitress waiting to do her job. He exhaled a shaky breath, the tension leaving his shoulders. "No," he muttered, waving her away. "Just water." Caprice nodded. She turned her back to him, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. She walked steadily to the bar, gripping the edge of the marble counter, until her knuckles turned white. She had it. The information. The double cross. Now she just had to survive giving it to the devil. The game broke up at 2 a.m. The men cashed out their heavy coats retrieved by the scarred guard at the door. Handshakes were exchanged. Fake smiles were plastered over simmering resentments. Caprice stood quietly by the bar, wiping down the polished marble with a damp cloth, just another piece of the scenery being left behind. When the heavy oak doors clicked shut, the silence in the penthouse was absolute. Denver was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the city lights. He had a glass of bourbon in his hand, the amber liquid catching the dim light. The room felt immense, hollowed out by the departure of the loud men and their dangerous egos. "Bring the bottle," Denver said quietly without turning around. Caprice picked up the heavy crystal decanter. Her hands were remarkably steady. The fear had burned off, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. She was clocking out. She just needed to deliver the check. She walked over and stood beside him, looking out at the same sprawling grid of city streets. She poured a splash of liquor into his glass. "Talk," he commanded. Caprice didn't hesitate. She didn't dress it up or soften the blow. She delivered the information with the precise, mechanical accuracy of a waitress repeating an order to a line cook. "Garrison," Caprice said flatly. He told Miller that the feds flipped the port inspector on Thursday. The raid is set for Tuesday when the crates hit Pier 4. He said he has a deal with the DA for immunity. He plans to let you take the fall and take over the South District by Wednesday. Denver didn't move. He didn't gasp or curse or throw his glass against the wall. The only sign that he had heard her was a slight tightening of his jaw, a microscopic shift in the muscles of his face. He took a slow sip of his bourbon. "Miller?" Denver asked, his voice chillingly calm. Miller called him a dead man, but he didn't argue. He listened. Caprice reported. Denver finally turned his head to look at her. The hollowness in his eyes was gone, replaced by something sharp and predatory. He was dissecting her again, looking for the lie. He found none. "You're sure about the phrasing?" he asked softly. "Flipped the port inspector." "Verbatim," Caprice replied, meeting his gaze without blinking. He also mentioned surveillance photos. He's seen them. Denver stared at her for a long moment. Then he set his glass down on a nearby side table. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out the thick manila envelope. The debt. Her freedom. He held it out to her. Caprice reached for it, her fingers brushing the rough paper. But Denver didn't let go immediately. He held the envelope, forcing her to maintain eye contact. "You did exactly what I asked, Caprice," he murmured. "You were invisible. You were precise." He released his grip. Caprice pulled the envelope to her chest. It felt heavy, too heavy. "You can go," Denver said, turning his back to her and walking toward a heavy wooden desk in the corner of the room. He picked up a secure phone. Caprice turned toward the door. She took 3 steps across the plush carpet, but her feet felt rooted. The heavy silence of the room was pressing down on her. She stopped. She looked back at him. He was dialing a number, his back still to her. "What happens to Garrison?" The words slipped out of her mouth before she could stop them. It was a stupid question, a dangerous question. Waitresses didn't ask what happened to the food after they cleared the plates. Denver paused the phone halfway to his ear. He slowly lowered the receiver and turned around. The predatory look in his eyes had sharpened into something lethal. "Do you really want to know the answer to that question, Caprice?" he asked. The tone of his voice was a warning, a bright red line painted on the floor. Caprice gripped the envelope tighter. She thought about the boy in the diner crying against the Formica. She thought about Mickey, the rat Sullivan, who would have broken her hands for missing a payment. She thought about the brutal, bleeding city outside that window, a machine that ground up people like her and spat them out. "He sold you out to the feds," Caprice said, her voice surprisingly steady. "If you kill him, the DA will know you knew. They'll use his disappearance to tear your operation apart anyway." Dead men can't testify, but dead informants launch crusades. The penthouse was dead silent. Caprice could hear her own pulse hammering in her ears. She had crossed the line. She was no longer serving drinks, she was playing the game. Denver stared at her. For 10 agonizing seconds he just looked at her. Then a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. It didn't reach his eyes, but it changed his entire demeanor. He looked almost impressed. "You're telling me how to run my business, Waitress?" he asked softly. "I'm telling you that a mess on the floor requires a mop." Caprice shot back. "And dead bodies are messy." Denver walked slowly back toward her. He stopped 2 feet away, towering over her. The scent of bourbon and expensive cologne washed over her. "And what would you suggest?" he asked, tilting his head. "You don't kill him." Caprice said, her mind working furiously, piecing together the fragments of overheard conversations. "You let the shipment arrive, but you don't put your product in the crates. You fill them with legal goods, machinery, textiles. Let the feds raid the docks. Let them open the boxes in front of the press. Garrison looks like a liar. The DA drops his immunity deal because his intel was garbage. And you?" She swallowed hard, looking up into his dark eyes. "You look like a legitimate businessman being harassed by the police. Garrison destroys himself." Denver stood perfectly still. The silence stretched tight as a piano wire. He looked at the woman in the cheap slacks and the oversized button-down shirt. The woman who had threatened him with hot coffee. The woman who owed $8,000 and worked 60 hours a week just to survive. He let out a low breath, shaking his head slightly. "You are entirely in the wrong line of work, Caprice Thompson," he murmured. He reached out and tapped the manila envelope she was clutching to her chest. "Your debt to Mickey is paid." Denver said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate hum. "But I think we both know you're not walking away tonight." Caprice looked down at the envelope. She had thought it was a ticket out. But as she looked back up at Denver Wallace staring into the dark, complicated depths of his eyes, she realized the terrifying truth. It wasn't a ticket out. It was a signing bonus. "I have the early shift tomorrow." Caprice whispered, a last desperate cling to her old life. Denver smirked. "Call in sick, Caprice. We have a shipment to reroute." Caprice didn't call in sick. She quit. She stood in her cramped kitchen at 4:15 a.m., listening to Archie's groggy voicemail greeting, and left a 10-second message. Then she took her stained polyester apron, folded it neatly, and dropped it into the trash can. It didn't feel victorious. It felt like stepping off a cliff in the pitch dark. For 10 years that diner had been her prison, but it had also been her anchor. Now she was adrift. By Monday night, she was sitting in a windowless logistics office overlooking the sprawling industrial grid of the South District docks. The air in the room was stale, smelling of burnt ozone from a bank of server racks and the sharp tang of cheap Chinese takeout. Caprice sat at a steel desk, staring at a grid of security camera feeds. Next to her, a massive man named Leo the Brute, with the jagged scar, was furiously typing on a mechanical keyboard, his thick fingers remarkably nimble. Denver stood by a whiteboard, his jacket off sleeves rolled up to the elbows. He was holding a dry erase marker, mapping out the container movements. He looked tired. The shadows under his eyes were bruised and heavy, but his movements were razor-sharp. He wasn't treating her like a hostage. He was treating her like a partner. And that terrified Caprice more than the gun ever had. "Container 402 and 405, Denver said, tapping the board. "They hit the manifest at midnight. The manifest gets automatically routed to the Port Authority. The Port Authority forwards it to the feds." "And what's inside them?" Caprice asked. She was leaning back in a cheap mesh office chair, her knees pulled up to her chest. She wore a plain grey sweater and jeans, the uniform of someone trying very hard to remain invisible. Denver turned to look at her. A grim, predatory smile touched the corners of his mouth. Industrial farming equipment, plows, threshers, 4 tons of heavy, rusty iron bound for a municipal auction in 3 weeks. Completely legal, completely boring. Where is the actual shipment? Sitting in a warehouse in New Jersey. Denver replied, tossing the marker onto the tray. It won't move until the heat dies down. We take a slight hit on delivery times, but we keep the cargo, and more importantly, we keep our freedom. Leo grunted, slapping the enter key. Manifest is live, boss. The bait is in the water. Denver nodded. He walked over to the desk, standing directly behind Caprice's chair. He was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off him. She could smell the faint, lingering scent of sandalwood and cold rain on his shirt. She kept her eyes glued to the monitors, her heart performing a slow, heavy drum roll against her ribs. Now we wait. Denver murmured. His voice was low, vibrating just above her ear. You sure about this, Caprice? The moment those feds open those doors, you are an accessory to a federal conspiracy. You helped orchestrate a fraud. Caprice finally looked up at him. She didn't shrink away from his proximity. She met his dark, probing gaze head-on. I was an accessory the moment I picked up that envelope, she said quietly. Besides, I've been committing fraud for a decade. I used to tell people Archie's meatloaf was made of actual beef. A short, sharp laugh escaped Denver's chest. It was a rare, unguarded sound that broke the heavy tension in the room. He reached down his large hand, resting on the back of her chair. His thumb brushed against the fabric of her sweater, tracing the curve of her shoulder blade. It was a casual gesture, almost absent-minded, but it sent a shockwave of electricity straight down her spine. You're a strange creature, Caprice Thompson, he said softly. I'm a survivor. She corrected. I just changed neighborhoods. They sat in the logistics office until the sun came up, painting the smoggy skies over the docks in bruised shades of purple and orange. Caprice drank bad coffee from a styrofoam cup, watching the monitors. She watched the massive cranes lift the steel shipping containers off the cargo ships, placing them onto the flatbed trucks. She watched the trucks line up at Pier 4. She wasn't scared anymore. The adrenaline had burned away, leaving a cold, hard clarity in its wake. She had spent her entire adult life taking orders from men who thought they owned her. Men who yelled over cold eggs. Men who broke fingers over late rent. For the first time in her life, she was the one writing the menu. At 7 a.m. Tuesday morning, the trap sprang. The local news was playing on a small, muted television mounted in the corner of the office. Caprice stood up, walking closer to the screen. On the monitor, a swarm of black SUVs had descended upon Pier 4. Men and women in tactical gear windbreakers, emblazoned with FBI in bright yellow letters, swarmed the loading docks. They moved with aggressive, practiced precision, setting up a perimeter and pushing back the bewildered dock workers. Turn it up, Denver ordered. Leo reached over and cranked the volume dial. A frantic field reporter was standing 100 yards away, shouting over the roar of a helicopter hovering above. An unprecedented dawn raid here at Pier 4. Sources inside the Bureau indicate they have acted on highly credible intelligence regarding a massive smuggling operation connected to the Wallace Syndicate. Agents are currently moving in on the flagged containers. Caprice held her breath. Her nails dug half-moons into the palms of her hands. If Garrison had been lying, if he hadn't spoken to the feds, if Denver had just thrown millions of dollars of business into a blender based on the word of a sleep-deprived waitress. On the screen, 2 agents used heavy bolt cutters to snap the seals on Container 402. The massive steel doors swung open. The camera zoomed in. There were no drugs. There were no illegal weapons. There was no untaxed liquor. There was a massive rusted John Deere combine harvester coated in dust and smelling heavily of old grease and fertilizer. The silence in the logistics office was absolute. Even Leo stopped typing. On the television, the FBI agent stood frozen, staring into the container. One of them kicked a tire in frustration. The field reporter stammered, trying to pivot the narrative. The unprecedented bust had just become a catastrophic, highly public embarrassment for the district attorney's office. Caprice let out a long, shuddering breath. Her knees felt weak. She reached out and gripped the edge of the steel desk to steady herself. It worked. Denver didn't cheer. He didn't gloat. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and dialed a number. He put it on speaker and set it on the desk. It rang 3 times before it was answered. "Yeah." Garrison's voice came through the speaker. He sounded out of breath, frantic. "Morning, Garrison," Denver said smoothly. He walked over to Caprice, standing shoulder to shoulder with her as they watched the fallout on the TV screen. "Did you catch the early news?" A heavy, suffocating silence hung on the other end of the line. Dom Garrison finally choked out. His voice was vibrating with pure, unfiltered terror. "Dom, I can explain. It wasn't me. Miller set me up. The feds, they—" "Stop talking, Garrison." Denver interrupted, his voice dropping to that lethal quiet register. "You're embarrassing yourself." "Dom, please. We can fix this. I have money in offshore accounts. I can make you whole." "You made a deal with the DA for immunity," Denver stated, reciting the facts like a coroner reading an autopsy report. "You gave them Pier 4. You gave them my name. The problem, Garrison, is that the DA only grants immunity when the intelligence is good, when it leads to a conviction." Denver paused, letting the reality of the situation sink in. "You didn't give them a conviction. You gave them a rusted tractor on live television. You humiliated a federal agency, which means they are going to drop your immunity deal by lunch. And when they drop it, they are going to come looking for someone to blame for the wasted taxpayer money." "Dom," Garrison sobbed. "I'm not going to kill you, Garrison." Denver said, his eyes fixed on Caprice. "I'm not even going to send someone to look for you. You are a dead man entirely on your own merits. Enjoy the feds." Denver hit the end button. The line went dead. He picked up the phone and slid it back into his pocket. He looked at the television one last time, watching the FBI agents pack up their gear in utter defeat. Then he reached over and clicked the TV off. The logistics office plunged back into silence, save for the hum of the servers. Leo cleared his throat. He stood up from his chair, grabbing his leather jacket from the back of the door. "I'm gonna go check the perimeter, boss. Make sure the trucks are clear." Denver nodded without looking at him. Leo shot Caprice a look not of suspicion this time, but of grudging, quiet respect, before walking out and shutting the heavy steel door behind him. They were alone. Denver turned fully toward Caprice. The cold, calculating mob boss was gone. The man standing in front of her was something else entirely. He looked at her with a heavy, intense hunger that made the air in the room feel thick and unbreathable. "You saved my empire," Denver said quietly. "I saved my own skin." Caprice replied, refusing to back down from his gaze. "Your empire was just collateral benefit." He stepped closer. The space between them vanished. He reached up his fingers, gently brushing a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. His touch was shockingly gentle for a man who ordered executions before breakfast. "You're a liar," he whispered, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "You could have taken the envelope and walked. You could have boarded a bus and disappeared. But you stayed." Caprice swallowed dryly. Her heart was beating so fast it physically hurt. "I didn't have anywhere to go." "You belong here." Denver said, his voice a rough, velvet rasp. "With me. You see the board the same way I do. You don't flinch at the blood. You just figure out how to clean it up." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. Caprice closed her eyes. She felt the warmth of his skin, the steady, rhythmic intake of his breath. She knew she was standing in the mouth of a predator. She knew this man was violent, ruthless, and entirely corrupt. But as his hand slid to the back of her neck, pulling her firmly against his chest, Caprice realized she didn't care. The diner was gone. The scared, exhausted waitress was dead. She opened her eyes, looking up into the dark, hollow eyes of the devil. So, Caprice whispered, her hands slowly coming up to rest flat against the lapels of his shirt. What's our next move? 6 months later, the smell of stale fryer grease was entirely gone from Caprice's hair. It had been replaced by the subtle, expensive scent of bergamot and dry cedar. She sat in the leather-backed chair behind the massive oak desk. In the penthouse, a pair of reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. The desk was covered in union payroll manifests, shipping schedules, and city zoning permits. The transition from balancing meatloaf plates to balancing millions in laundered funds had been shockingly seamless. Chaos was chaos, whether it involved screaming line cooks or angry longshoremen. Caprice knew how to organize a mess. Rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the city skyline into a blurred watercolor of grey and steel. Denver stood by the bar, pouring 2 glasses of scotch. He wore dark trousers and a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal the heavy ink of a sprawling, jagged tattoo wrapping around his left forearm. He walked over, setting a heavy crystal tumbler on the desk, next to her neatly stacked papers. "You're squinting," he noted, leaning his hip against the edge of the desk. "I'm squinting because Miller is a greedy, sloppy idiot," Caprice muttered, tossing her pen onto the blotter. She rubbed her temples, feeling the familiar, dull throb of a tension headache. "I've been tracking the transit union payouts for the last 3 quarters. He's skimming, and he's not even doing it well. He's running the excess through a shell company registered to his wife's maiden name." Denver took a sip of his scotch. He didn't look surprised. He looked at Caprice with that same dark, quiet pride that had become a permanent fixture in his eyes over the last 6 months. "How much?" he asked. 400,000, give or take," Caprice said, leaning back in her chair and picking up the glass. The liquor burned a pleasant, warm path down her throat. "He's getting bold, Denver. Garrison's arrest created a vacuum on the east side, and Miller thinks you're too focused on the port expansion to notice his fingers in the till." "Miller thinks I'm distracted," Denver corrected smoothly. He reached out his knuckles, grazing her cheek. "Word on the street is that Wallace lost his edge, that he let a waitress into his inner circle and went soft." Caprice snorted a very unladylike sound that echoed sharply in the quiet room. "I've never been soft a day in my life." "I know," Denver murmured, his voice dropping into that low, intimate register that still made her pulse jump. "But Miller doesn't. He requested a sit-down tonight. Here, he says he wants to discuss the new trucking contracts, but Leo intercepted a text to his lieutenants. Miller is bringing 4 heavy hitters. He's planning a hostile takeover Caprice. He thinks he can walk into my house and take my seat." Caprice stared at the rain lashing against the glass. The old Caprice, the one who hid in her apartment with a heavy iron skillet, would have felt panic. But that woman was dead. What Caprice felt now was a cold, absolute irritation. She had spent all morning color-coding these ledgers. She was not about to let a cheap thug ruin her filing system. "He's bringing muscle?" she asked, her voice dangerously calm. 4 men, Denver confirmed. "Leo has our people on standby in the lobby, but if guns go off in this penthouse, it brings the police. We need this handled quietly." Caprice took another sip of her scotch. She looked at the stack of union manifests. She thought about leverage and survival, and the fundamental mechanics of power. Men like Miller respected violence, but they feared ruin. Violence was a risk they understood. Complete financial and personal destruction was a ghost in the dark. "Call Leo," Caprice said, standing up from the desk. She took off her reading glasses and tossed them onto the leather blotter. "Tell him to let Miller and his men come up. but have Leo shut down the elevators the second they step into the hallway. No one else comes up. No one goes down." Denver tilted his head, studying her face. "What are you planning?" "I'm planning to cater the meeting," Caprice said. A cold, razor-sharp smile touched her lips. "I think it's time Mr. Miller learned that the help listens to everything." The heavy oak doors swung open at exactly 9 p.m. Miller walked in, shaking the rain from his heavy wool coat. He looked bigger than Caprice remembered his face, flushed and aggressive. 4 men trailed behind him, spreading out immediately. They didn't bother checking their coats. They kept their hands shoved deep into their pockets, their eyes scanning the shadows of the penthouse. Denver sat at the head of the mahogany poker table, completely relaxed. His jacket was off. His hands rested flat on the green felt. Caprice stood by the wet bar in the corner. She wore a tailored black suit, her dark hair pulled back into a severe knot. She blended perfectly into the dim lighting. Just a shadow. Just a server. Dom. Miller barked, his voice loud and artificially jovial. He didn't sit down. He paced to the opposite end of the table, leaning his heavy hands on the wood. "Appreciate the late meeting. We got some serious logistical issues to hammer out regarding the new trucking routes." "Do we?" Denver asked mildly. "We do," Miller sneered, dropping the friendly act. He glanced back at his men, a silent signal of readiness. "The boys are tired, Dom. The port expansion is eating up our time, and the cuts aren't reflecting the sweat. We need a restructuring. The transit union is taking a larger slice, effective immediately, and I'm taking over the East Side operations." It wasn't a negotiation. It was an eviction notice. Denver didn't flinch. He looked past Miller, his eyes catching Caprice's in the dim light. Caprice picked up a thick, leather-bound folder from the bar. She stepped out of the shadows. Her soft-soled shoes made absolutely no sound against the hardwood floor. She walked the perimeter of the room, approaching the table with silent, practiced steps. Miller glanced at her annoyance flashing across his meaty face. "Get out of here, sweetheart. The adults are talking." Caprice didn't stop. She didn't look down. She walked directly up to Miller and slapped the heavy folder down onto the mahogany table, right between his massive hands. The sharp smack echoed through the tense room. Miller jolted, glaring at her. "What the hell is this?" "That is a heavily documented audit of the Transit Union Pension Fund," Caprice said. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. It was the exact same tone she had used to stop a bullet in a greasy diner. "Including the $412,000 you funneled into an offshore shell company registered to your wife, Brenda." Miller froze. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, mottled gray. Caprice didn't give him a second to breathe. She leaned in, placing her hands on the table, mirroring his aggressive posture. "Behind that tab is a copy of your current tax return. Behind that is a draft of an email addressed to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division attaching all of these documents. And behind that is a list of the union reps you shorted to steal that money. Men who will gladly rip you apart with their bare hands when they find out you bought a vacation home in Boca Raton with their retirement." The 4 heavy hitters behind Miller shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other. Loyalty was a fickle thing when pension funds were involved. "You're bluffing." Miller choked out, but his eyes were frantically scanning the top page of the ledger. He saw the routing numbers. He saw his wife's name. "Leo has a finger on the send button downstairs." Caprice lied effortlessly. "If Denver doesn't call him in exactly 3 minutes, that email goes to the feds, and copies go to your union lieutenants. You won't just go to federal prison, Miller. You'll go there completely broke, and your own men will put a bounty on your head." Silence slammed down on the room, heavy, suffocating, and absolute. Miller looked at Caprice. Really looked at her. He expected to see fear. He expected to see a woman playing out of her depth. Instead, he saw a woman staring at him, with the cold, dead-eyed exhaustion of someone who was entirely done dealing with his mess. He looked at Denver. Denver was simply watching Caprice, a faint, terrifying smirk on his lips. "You let a waitress run your books." Miller whispered, the fight completely draining out of his massive frame. She's not a waitress, Miller," Denver said softly, finally standing up. He walked slowly around the table, stopping next to Caprice. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a heavy physical wall of protection. "She's the reason you're going to hand over control of the transit union tonight. Voluntarily. You are going to sign the contracts, step down for health reasons, and move to Boca Raton. If you ever step foot in my city again, I won't use the IRS. I'll use Leo." Miller stood, paralyzed. He looked at his 4 men. They weren't moving. They weren't reaching for their guns. They were looking at the folder on the table. Miller swallowed hard. His shoulders slumped in total defeat. "Where do I sign?" 30 minutes later, the penthouse was empty again. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, leaving only the sound of the rain against the glass. The signed contracts sat on the desk. Miller was gone. The threat was neutralized. Caprice leaned against the wet bar, her adrenaline finally crashing. She closed her eyes, letting out a long, shaky breath. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her glass of scotch. Denver walked over. He gently took the glass from her shaking fingers and set it on the marble counter. He stepped into her space, crowding her against the bar. He boxed her in with his arms, his dark eyes searching her face. "You lied." He murmured, his voice a low, rough hum in the quiet room. "Leo doesn't have an email drafted to the IRS." "No," Caprice admitted, her voice breathless. "But Miller didn't know that. People always bluff Denver. You just have to know which nerve to press to make them fold." Denver let out a low laugh, pressing his forehead against hers. He reached up, pulling the severe knot from her hair, letting the dark strands fall loose around her shoulders. He tangled his fingers in her hair, tilting her head back. "You are entirely terrifying," he whispered right against her lips. "I told you." Caprice breathed, wrapping her arms around his neck, pulling him closer into the dark. "Pull that stunt again, and I'll end you." Denver didn't reply with words. He kissed her, a deep, consuming claim that tasted of scotch and absolute power. And as the rain washed the city clean outside, Caprice knew she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was exactly where she belonged. Did Caprice's brutal rise to power leave you breathless, from a greasy diner counter to ruling the city's criminal underworld? Caprice proved that the most dangerous weapon isn't a gun. It's a woman with absolutely nothing to lose. If you loved this tense, slow-burn Mafia romance, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with fellow dark romance readers who crave strong, unstoppable female leads, and subscribe to the channel for more gripping, gritty stories delivered straight to your feed. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite Caprice moment?